Good evening and welcome to another episode of Unscripted and Unchained RPG Review. I am DM Bloodworth, and as you can see by the graphics, tonight's video is going to be a part one of a series of videos that I'm going to do where I'm talking about old school Dungeons and Dragons. So basically, from the white box forward through AD&D second edition. And with each of the additions or variations of Dungeons and Dragons, I'm going to be asking the same question. All right, how did the rules describe what a campaign was, and more specifically, how did the rules explain how to run campaigns? So once again, I am going to begin with OD&D, the White Box Collector's Edition, which I have here. So there are three books in that edition, and although what I'm going to focus on is only in the um, the first the first book and the third book. Now, I was trying to figure out different ways of showing this for you and going through. And I tried to use. I'm going to switch views here. I tried to use my desktop camera in order to zoom in on the booklets and actually read it verbatim along with you, so that you can see what I'm reading. But the camera, just for whatever reason, just could not really grab focus on the books. These are the first printing of this particular white box, so 1974. They're kind of old, and I guess the images are just of the typing are just not dark enough and crisp enough for the camera to grab a hold of focus on them. So I am going to, because I want to really do this, as authentically as possible. I'm just going to read through the sections of these. Now I do have a PDF, and the PDF is the one volume edition of all three of these. But as I was trying to go through it and actually pick up on the various aspects that I wanted to focus on, it was actually much easier just to use the books than it was to use that PDF. So I'm probably not going to rely on that PDF at all. So I'm going to start with the rules for fantastic medieval war games, campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. And this is volume one of a three booklet set. This is Men and Magic. I'm going to go right here to page 5, and it starts to talk about the preparation for a campaign. And even though it's a very short passage, you can make some inferences as to what he's really talking about, that makes up a campaign. So the referee bears the entire burden here, but if care and thought are used, the reward will be more than repay him. First, the referee must draw out a minimum of half a dozen maps of the levels of his underworld, people them with monsters of various horrid aspect, distribute treasures accordingly, and note the location of the latter two on keys, each corresponding to the appropriate level. This operation will be more fully described in the third volume of these rules. When this task is completed, the participants can then be allowed to make their first descent into the dungeons beneath the huge ruined pile, a vast castle built by generations of mad wizards and insane geniuses. Before they begin, players must decide what role they will play in the campaign, human or otherwise, fighter, cleric, or magic user. Thereafter, they will work upwards if they survive as they gain experience. First, however, it is necessary to describe fully the roles possible. And so he gets into the rules of, what is a fighting man, what is a magic user, what is a cleric. So as you can tell, he's talking about creating a mega dungeon, and the mega dungeon is going to have different levels that are appropriate for each level of the dungeon. And he says no fewer than 6 layers. And this is what becomes the an early idea of a campaign, is the fact that a mega dungeon becomes a campaign, and the players will take their characters through these mega dungeons, starting off at the first level, and plus the first level of the dungeon complex itself. And as they gain experience, they will go deeper and deeper and deeper. So you see this in things like the Temple of Elemental Evil. But in the official modules that came out with Dungeons and Dragons, and particularly Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, you'll see that there are a series of adventure modules that are all part of one campaign that typically take the characters through several different level bands. And these are in effect called campaigns. I also wanted to focus on another aspect that Gary Gygax brings up here, and as well as Dave Arneson, and that is the aspect of time. All right, so time in the dungeon is measured differently than time in the wilderness. And so that's where we come up with in volume 3 of the book. This is the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. And I want to specifically talk about time. And one of the reasons why I'm doing these videos is that for the last several weeks, there has been a lot of discussion amongst the OSR about campaigns, and what constitutes a campaign, and what's the timekeeping in a campaign. And so that's why I wanted to focus on each of these installments of Dungeons and Dragons, and just see what they actually wrote in the book, so that you can see what the disputes might be about, or just see what might work well for you. And so I wanted to go on time. So as the campaign goes into full swing, it is probable that there will be various groups going every which way, and all at different time periods. It is suggested that a record of each player be kept, the referee checking off each week as it is spent. Recon the passage of time thus. A dungeon expedition equals 1 week. A wilderness adventure, 1 move equals a day. And they speak about movements where in a wilderness travel, the player characters might move 3 times, and so cover the distance of 3 hexes. And then a lot of the discussion was that they would move out 3 hexes and then return back to their starting point, ostensibly a village where they began from, and then return back, and then decompress, heal, rest, and do whatever. And so that would actually span the a 1 week time period in game. And then in the real world, if they're playing on a Monday and they go out 3 hexes, return, go on an adventure. Remember, an expedition, within a dungeon might take a full week. So maybe they're traveling, maybe not all 3 days they're traveling, maybe they're only traveling 1 day. then they're spending time in a dungeon expedition, which might spend, an entire week there. And then in that same game session, they're returning back that 1 day trip. So they've actually spent about 9 days adventuring. And if they're to meet up the next week, well, their characters are still in the movement. And so the theory is that the players would have a different group of characters that they're also playing simultaneously with this, their initial group of characters. And then they would go on an adventure and then come back. And then after they're done, then the other group might be ready to play again. And they go back to that group of characters and pick up where they left off. Now, it goes in, the time for the dungeon adventures considers only preparation and the typical 1 day descent into the pits. The time for wilderness expeditions would include days of rest and recuperation. Actual time would not be counted off for the players out on the wilderness adventure, but it would for those nude in their dens. That's a weird word. Nude in their dens, hide holes, keeps, castles, etc., as well as for those in the throes of some expedition in the underworld. So again, actual time would not be counted off for players out on the wilderness adventures. So again, there's that consolidation of game time versus real world time when you're traveling in the wilderness. And so it's kind of built into this rule set here that not all time in game is 1-for-1. And but if you choose to do that, then you have to make sure that the player characters are always returning within a time frame that would fit within the 1 week's time if they're playing every week, once a week. But if they're playing more frequently than that, then it really does shorten distances and such that they would be traveling, unless you apply that rule of, playing around with wilderness travel and such, so that if they go on a 1 month journey, you wouldn't necessarily have to say, well, all right, well, we're not going to play those characters for the next month, and we're going to go to different groups of characters instead until that 1 month has passed on. I don't really get that impression that that's what's supposed to happen based on this, but but again, it's an interesting concept, but it's not really implied that way in these rules. So let me go back to Men and Magic again and see what else he has in here when it talks about other elements the of the rules that come into play. And he starts talking about I should say, Gary and Dave Arneson start talking about non-player characters, and eventually, as well as relatives. All right. And these elements are starting to lay the foundation for longer lasting campaigns. And the reason why I say that is if you're only doing a series of adventures in a dungeon crawl, and the players will be running their characters through that dungeon crawl for 6, 7, 10 sessions, and then once they're done, they're returning home and going to retire after their big adventure. Excuse me. that's going to be a fairly short campaign. And once these rules start talking about relatives and NPCs and later on expert hirelings and the building of strongholds and such, now you're starting to see the true intent is to have very long campaigns and campaigns that are going to take the player characters from starting off as adventurers and then moving on into becoming, um, becoming lords of the land or barons or such. And again, we're going to take a look at this third installment here. I'm sorry, it's actually not in the third installment. Let's see if Barron's was bring up. Oh, so oh yeah, in the third. I had the wrong book there. So let's take a look at where they start talking about barons. So page 24, or baronies. Page 24. And again, this gets to here we go. So, baronies, another advantage occurring to those who build their strongholds in wildernesses is that they will gain control over the surrounding countryside. Clearing the countryside of monsters is the first requirement. The player characters move the force to the hex, and the referee rolls a die to determine if there is a monster encountered, and if there is one, the player character's force must remove it. If no monsters is encountered and the hex is already cleared, territory up to 20 miles distant from the stronghold may be kept clear of monsters once cleared, the inhabitation of the stronghold being considered as sufficient to maintain the monster-free status. Within each territory, there will be from 2 to 8 villages, from 100 to 400 inhabitants each. This populace will bring an annual tax revenue of 10 gold pieces each. The referee may also allow various investments into territory, adjudicating revenue according to investment area potential. Some possible investments are, and then they go through a whole bunch of various things. There is there are upkeep rules. There's angry villagers if they are getting upset with the Baron's rules and such. There is land combat and obviously other mass combat potentials that are taking place. Long haul campaigns is what they're talking about here. So in the very earliest version of Dungeons and Dragons, you do have that focus, that ultimate goal of the player characters becoming part of the ruling class, and then going through and maintaining that, or at least trying to maintain that level of control over their territories. And this is where that particular player character is going to become more of an NPC in my view, be less hands-on and more the big picture, of a campaign, sometimes called the patron, of a campaign, and then other characters, possibly by that same player, will then pick up and start doing those, that boots on the ground adventuring or maintaining other aspects, actually going out and doing the errands and such that the patron is asking, that character to do. So again, a very, very strong focus on long-term campaigns. And that's something that I think you're going to see as I go through these various these various versions of Dungeons and Dragons, these old school versions of Dungeons and Dragons, is that there's there's a sense that campaigns are long, and that they kind of project that, with the exception of possibly AD&D, which breaks them down into adventure module series. These are much more open-ended and much more, kind of hex crawl and spreading that influence over a larger particular area and amassing huge followings of or vassals that are actually serving the player character. So really interesting, and like I said, this is a very first dig through of this. Now, when I go to the next edition of Dungeons and Dragons, so the Holmes edition, I am going to do a compare and contrast to see where does Holmes take this here and make any changes, or as it relates to campaigns, and what enhancements happen, if any. Do the rules get a little bit more simplified, or just more clear to see, or do they dramatically change and really starts looking at campaigns in a very much different way? So really looking forward to that. And so it's nice to kind of dig through the older editions and look very specifically for just one element of role playing, whether it be specific to Dungeons and Dragons or just in general. I mean, when I started going through these, I started seeing those three pillars of role playing. So obviously, combat is there, exploration. So a lot of that wilderness travel, or even dungeon delving, is a form of exploration, and that human interaction where they're building strongholds and they're hiring different types of henchmen or expert hirelings in order to conduct their the baronies. That's another element of role playing that you see right in the very beginning. So 1974, you see it right in the very beginning that that groundwork for the three pillars was put there. The intent of long-term campaigns and multi-layered campaigns is also here in OD&D. So in some of my previous videos, I'm talking about campaigns and talking about time usage, and even though some of those arguments by the Bro SR was that the one-to-one is really established in AD&D, I saw more of what they were talking about here in the original, not so much in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So and so we'll be able to see that transition. We'll see how we go from here, move on to Holmes and Moldvay, and then we'll get to AD&D First Edition. Then I'll move on to Dungeons and Dragons, the Basic Expert series of the Frank Metzner editions of Dungeons and Dragons, and then we'll move on to or I'll move on to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition. So that's the chronology of these releases, and we will most certainly see great differences. At least I'm anticipating to see great differences between the advanced Dungeons and Dragons and the OD&D and then D&D thereafter. So once again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me switch views one more time. And so this is my first part one, OD&D White Box Collector's Edition, and looking into the question of, how does old school Dungeons and Dragons describe campaigns and talk about how to run them. So I'm going to keep on doing this with each edition or version of Dungeons and Dragons, and keep on asking the same question over and over again. And then I will certainly do a compare and contrast in between each one as well. So once again, thanks for joining. I hope you liked this video. If you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave your comments in there. And if there's anything that you would like for me to focus on, or a game that you want me to take a look at, certainly welcome those comments in there as well. And I will certainly go and take a look at them. So once again, have a great day, and you'll have a good night. Take care.